At 7:21 on a quiet weekday morning, Britain could have woken up to something no living generation had ever seen. Not mourning, not a funeral, but a sentence so disruptive it would instantly rewrite royal history. The king had stepped aside. No death, no long farewell, just a decision. And if that ever happened, it wouldn't be because of politics, scandal, or ambition. It would only happen if something behind palace walls had gone seriously, irreversibly wrong. For centuries, the British monarchy has operated on one unbreakable rule. You reign until the end. Not until it's uncomfortable. Not until the job becomes too heavy. Until the very last breath. That's why one word carries more weight than almost any other in royal history. Abdication, a word so toxic it hasn't appeared in official palace language since 1936. When Edward VIII nearly shattered the institution by choosing personal desire over duty, since then, abdication hasn't just been rare, it's been unthinkable. And yet, royal watchers have quietly asked the same question in recent years. If abdication ever returned, what could possibly force it? The attention has inevitably turned toward King Charles III, a man who waited longer than any heir in modern history to wear the crown. Decades of preparation, a lifetime of restraint. And yet, within a remarkably short reign, subtle signs began triggering concern. Shorter public appearances, visible fatigue, moments where aides seemed unusually close, unusually alert. None of it confirmed anything on its own, but together they formed a pattern that commentators couldn't ignore. And patterns are where speculation begins. Reports and online discussion have increasingly focused on moments that never made headlines on their own. Missed engagements quietly reframed as scheduling adjustments. Speeches trimmed down at the last minute. Diplomatic appearances that felt carefully controlled. Royal commentators stressed caution, but curiosity kept growing. Because history has taught observers one thing. When the palace grows quieter, it's rarely because everything is fine. According to unverified accounts circulating among royal analysts, the deeper concern wasn't physical stamina. It was cognitive strain. Difficulty processing long briefings. Increased reliance on written notes. Moments of hesitation where decisiveness once came naturally. None of this has ever been officially confirmed, and it's crucial to say that clearly, but speculation gained traction because of one uncomfortable reality. A modern monarch cannot function symbolically alone. The role demands clarity, consistency, and mental sharpness. And when those qualities are even questioned, the consequences escalate fast. That's where the real dilemma begins. Because the monarchy has options, but none of them are clean. One path is to continue quietly compensating behind the scenes while presenting stability to the public. Another is to invoke regency, shifting responsibility while preserving the crown in name. But both carry risks. A regency raises uncomfortable questions about capability, and pretending everything is normal in the digital age is nearly impossible. Every pause is clipped. Every expression analyzed. Every stumble amplified. Behind closed doors, the most painful option reportedly entered the conversation. Stepping aside entirely. Abdication not as escape, but as containment, a controlled decision made while awareness and dignity were still intact. Royal historians have long argued that abdication isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's an admission that the institution matters more than the individual. But that argument collides head-on with British tradition, where quitting has never been framed as noble. The emotional cost of such a choice would be staggering, not just for the king, but for his heir. Prince William has spent his life preparing for a future role, not an immediate one. Premature succession would mean assuming the crown while his father still lives, watches, and carries the weight of having surrendered it. That dynamic is unprecedented in modern Britain. A living former king isn't just unusual, it's destabilizing. It blurs hierarchy, legacy, and identity in ways the monarchy has never had to manage. Royal insiders have long acknowledged that. William's preparation was designed for a gradual transition shaped by time and experience. A sudden transfer of power would compress decades of expectation into a single moment. And unlike succession through death, abdication forces everyone involved to confront the change directly. There's no natural pause for grief, no emotional closure, just adjustment under pressure. From a constitutional standpoint, the nightmare deepens. Abdication sets precedent. Once it happens for one reason, it becomes imaginable for others. Illness today, pressure tomorrow. Personal dissatisfaction down the line. That slippery slope has terrified constitutional scholars for generations. The monarchy survives on predictability, on ritual, on the sense that some things do not bend. Abdication bends everything. And yet, the alternative may be worse. A monarch struggling privately while projecting strength publicly risks eroding trust altogether. In a media environment that dissects every frame, secrecy collapses quickly. Once credibility cracks, it doesn't heal easily. Some royal experts argue that choosing transparency over tradition could actually preserve the institution long term, even if it damages one reign permanently. What makes this scenario so haunting isn't drama or scandal, it's restraint, a decision made not out of desire, but necessity. A king choosing to step away not because he wants to, but because continuing could do more harm than leaving. That kind of choice doesn't invite applause. It invites judgment, and history is rarely kind to those who break tradition, even when they believe they're protecting it. If abdication were ever to happen again, it wouldn't feel triumphant. It would feel heavy, quiet, administrative, a signature on paper that ends one reign and begins another in the same day. No mourning period, no national breath held in grief, just a sudden realization that the crown has moved by choice, not fate. And that's the part that would echo for generations. Because once a crown can be surrendered, it is never quite the same again. The question wouldn't just be whether it was the right decision. It would be whether the monarchy could ever return to the illusion of permanence it once relied on. Different cultures view abdication differently. In some, it's practical. In others, it's unforgivable. And in Britain, it sits somewhere between duty and betrayal, depending on who you ask. So, where are you watching this from? And in your view, would stepping aside be an act of weakness? Or the hardest form of responsibility imaginable? Because if the crown ever passes without death, it won't be remembered for spectacle or ceremony. It will be remembered for silence, for the weight of a decision made behind closed doors, and for the moment tradition met reality and neither emerged unchanged. The silence that would follow such a moment is what makes it so unsettling. Not the headlines, not the debates, but the quiet realization that something ancient had shifted. Because monarchies don't just rely on law or ceremony, they rely on belief. The belief that the crown endures no matter the cost to the person wearing it. And once that belief cracks, even slightly, it forces everyone to reassess what the crown actually represents. For the king himself, stepping aside wouldn't feel like relief. It would feel like loss layered on top of failure. A lifetime spent preparing for a role defined by endurance, only to leave it early. Not by choice in the ordinary sense, but by necessity. That distinction matters, but history doesn't always care. History compresses nuance into labels, and the king who abdicated is a label that follows forever. No matter how justified the decision may have been, there's also the uncomfortable reality of what comes after. A former king doesn't disappear. He remains present, living with the consequences in real time. Watching speeches he once would have delivered, seeing portraits replaced, hearing his son addressed with titles that once belonged to him, that psychological weight is something no abdication document can resolve. It's a burden carried quietly. Long after the public moves on to the next crisis, for the new king, the challenge would be just as complex. Ascending the throne under normal circumstances is already overwhelming. Doing so while the previous monarch is alive adds an entirely new layer of pressure. Every decision invites comparison. Every misstep risks being framed as proof that the transition came too soon. Even strength can be misread as disrespect, and restraint can be mistaken for weakness. Public reaction would almost certainly fracture. Some would see abdication as humane, even brave, a recognition of limits in a role that historically denied them. Others would see it as betrayal, a breaking of an unspoken contract between sovereign and state. Social media would amplify both extremes, compressing complex constitutional realities into emotional verdicts delivered in seconds. And then there's the long-term consequence no one can measure yet. Future heirs would grow up knowing abdication is possible, that the crown is not only inherited, but relinquishable. That knowledge alone changes how power is perceived. It shifts the monarchy subtly closer to an institution managed by choice rather than destiny. For some, that evolution would feel overdue. For others, it would feel like the beginning of the end. What makes this hypothetical so powerful is that it forces an uncomfortable question. Is the monarchy about the person or the function? If it's about function, then stepping aside when unable to perform could be seen as the ultimate service. But if it's about and myths matter. They outlive individuals. They smooth over contradictions. They give meaning to ceremony. Once those myths are challenged by reality, they don't vanish, but they weaken. They require reinterpretation. And reinterpretation is dangerous ground for an institution built on continuity. If abdication were ever framed not as failure, but as responsibility, it would mark a turning point, not just for one reign, but for the monarchy's relationship with modern expectations. Transparency versus tradition. Humanity versus permanence. Honesty versus illusion. None of those battles have clean winners. That's why this scenario continues to fascinate royal watchers, historians, and the public alike. Not because people want to see a king fall, but because they want to understand where the line truly is. How much can tradition bend before it breaks? And how much can a person give before stepping back becomes the only honest option left? In the end, the crown is more than gold and ceremony. It's a promise. A promise to endure, to serve, to carry weight most people will never experience. And if that promise is ever renegotiated, even for the most human of reasons, it changes the story forever. Because a crown passed by choice doesn't just move forward. It leaves a shadow behind. And history will spend generations debating whether that shadow represents weakness or the most difficult kind of strength imaginable. That shadow would follow every step of the reign that comes next. Not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently. In speeches, in public expectations, in the way every future challenge is framed. Because once a monarch steps aside while still living, the idea of permanence quietly dissolves. The crown no longer feels inevitable. It feels conditional, and that changes how people listen. Every address from the new king would be weighed, not just on its own merit, but against the question no one can fully silence. Would this have happened if the crown had remained untouched by abdication? Would this moment feel steadier if succession had followed the ancient path instead of a chosen one? Even supporters would ask it privately. Critics would ask it loudly. There's also the issue no palace briefing can resolve. Authority drawn from inheritance feels different than authority drawn from transition. One feels ordained by time. The other feels accelerated by circumstance. And while both are legally equal, emotionally they are worlds apart. The monarchy survives not because people understand constitutional mechanics, but because they feel continuity. Anything that disrupts that feeling creates friction. Behind the scenes, the institution would work tirelessly to re-anchor that sense of stability. Symbols would matter more than ever. Ceremony would be sharpened, language carefully chosen, appearances choreographed with precision. The message would be simple and relentless. The crown endures. The crown continues. But repetition alone can't erase memory. People remember why a change happened, not just that it did. For the former king, life would narrow in quiet ways. No more red boxes. No more weekly briefings. No more moments where the fate of policy, diplomacy, or national mood passes through his hands. That silence can be heavier than responsibility. To go from being the constitutional center of a nation to a private figure overnight is not retirement. It's erasure from a role that defined identity. Some would interpret his withdrawal as dignity. Others would never forgive it. And neither perspective would fully capture the reality, because abdication under pressure is an escape. It's surrender to limitation. And limitation is something power is never supposed to admit. As time passed, historians would begin the slow work of reframing the moment. Early narratives are always emotional. Later, ones become analytical. They'd examine context, medical realities, media pressure, the evolution of public expectations. They'd ask whether the monarchy of the 21st century can survive on 19th century assumptions, whether insisting on endurance at all costs is strength, or stubbornness disguised as tradition. Future heirs would grow up studying this moment not as a footnote, but as a warning, a reminder that the crown demands more than longevity. It demands judgment, including the judgment to know when holding on does more harm than letting go. That lesson alone could reshape how future monarchs approach duty, vulnerability, and the limits of endurance. And yet, no amount of analysis can undo the emotional truth. A crown passed by choice feels different because it is different. It replaces inevitability with agency, destiny with decision, and once that shift occurs, it cannot be reversed. The monarchy may continue, it may even thrive, but it will do so changed. This is why the idea continues to unsettle people across cultures. In some places, stepping aside is pragmatic. In others, it's honorable. In Britain, it cuts against something deeply ingrained, the belief that the crown absorbs suffering so the nation doesn't have to think about it. Abdication forces the opposite. It makes suffering visible, and visibility is uncomfortable. In the end, this isn't just a story about one king or one decision. It's about whether ancient institutions can coexist with modern reality without losing themselves. Whether duty means endurance, no matter the cost, or honesty about limits. Whether strength is measured by how long you hold on, or by knowing when to step back. If abdication ever truly reshapes the monarchy, it won't be because of outrage or applause. It will be because of quiet recalibration. A collective understanding that something fundamental shifted, even if no one can quite agree on what replaced it. And long after the debates fade, one truth will remain. The crown will still glitter. The ceremonies will still unfold. The titles will still be spoken. But beneath it all, the knowledge will linger that the crown is worn by humans, not myths. And humans, no matter how prepared, are not infinite. That realization may weaken the monarchy in the eyes of some, but for others, it may be the very thing that allows it to survive. And that possibility is what keeps this idea alive in public imagination. Not the drama, not the speculation, but the uncomfortable recognition that even the most rigid traditions are ultimately carried by people with limits. The monarchy has always presented itself as something larger than any one individual, yet it has always depended entirely on individuals to embody it. When one of them reaches the edge of what they can carry, the illusion strains. Supporters of tradition argue that the strain is the point, that the crown exists precisely to demand endurance beyond comfort, that stepping aside, even for understandable reasons, risks turning kingship into something negotiable. If one king can choose to stop, then future monarchs may feel empowered to ask themselves the same question. And once that question becomes acceptable, the role subtly transforms. But others see it differently. They argue that refusing to acknowledge human limits in a modern age doesn't preserve strength, it manufactures fragility. That forcing a visibly struggling monarch to continue invites far greater damage than a controlled, honest transition ever could. In their view, the real risk isn't abdication, it's denial. This tension doesn't resolve cleanly because it speaks to two competing visions of leadership, one rooted in sacrifice and symbolism, the other in responsibility and realism. Both claim loyalty to the institution. Both believe they are protecting it. And both cannot be fully satisfied at the same time. What complicates everything further is time. Time reveals outcomes no one can predict in the moment. A decision that feels catastrophic in one decade can feel inevitable in the next, and one that feels progressive can later be seen as the first crack in something that once felt immovable. History rarely delivers verdicts quickly, and when it does, it often revises them. If a living abdication were ever to define this era, it would likely be studied less for the act itself and more for what followed. Did stability return quickly? Did public confidence recover? Did the new reign establish its own authority without being haunted? Those answers would shape whether abdication becomes a cautionary tale or a reluctant blueprint. For the public, though, the response would be far simpler and far more emotional. People don't experience monarchy through legal theory. They experience it through moments, through faces on screens, through rituals repeated since childhood. Any disruption to that rhythm feels personal, even to those who claim indifference. That's why reactions would range from empathy to anger, often within the same person. And perhaps that's the most telling detail of all. This scenario doesn't divide people neatly into supporters and critics. It unsettles almost everyone, just in different ways, because it forces a confrontation with something monarchy has always tried to smooth over. Mortality, decline. The point at which dignity and endurance no longer align. In the end, whether abdication is seen as failure or foresight depends on what people believe leadership truly demands. absolute sacrifice or honest judgment, silence or transparency, permanence or adaptation. None of those answers are universal, and none of them come without cost. If the crown ever truly passes by choice rather than fate, it won't signal the end of monarchy, but it will mark the end of something else: the belief that the institution is untouched by human limitation. That belief has always been comforting. It has also always been false. And once a nation collectively acknowledges that truth, even reluctantly, it changes how power is viewed forever. Not weaker, not stronger, just real. That is why this question refuses to fade. Not because people want to